Good afternoon. I would think that when you were leaving today to come here, to come to the Holocaust Museum, it's probably not what you expected to find. I'm sure your teacher told you several things, what to possibly expect, but what you saw inside there is not really what you expected. It's pretty horrifying. At any rate, my name is George Spooner, and I live in Chesterfield, and I'm a grandfather. My grandchildren are about your age. As a matter of fact, my kids went to Ladue schools, graduated from Ladue schools. They all live in St. Louis. I live in Chesterfield right now, so we're kind of next door neighbors. And I was born a long time ago, 78 years ago, in Vienna, Austria, in 1928. That makes me pretty old. But I remembered all the things back at that time. I've been blessed with a good memory. And I'm going to relate some of the things that happened to a little boy, a fourth grader, 9 years old, the things that I remember. But first, feel assured of this. Everything that you've heard and everything that you saw is 100% true. I mean, you can't make these things up. There are people who say the Holocaust never happened. I mean, today, presidents of countries say the Holocaust never happened. People here in the United States say, no, it didn't happen. Well, 6.5 million people perished, were killed, I can say, where are my relatives? I'm lucky I made it. And I'll tell you some of that story. But first, I want to kind of clarify a few things. Here in this wonderful country that we live in, there are now 300 million of us. When I came to the United States, there were about 140 million people, so it's more than doubled. You have advantages that other children don't have. And it goes back to something that's called hatred. Because how can something like what you saw happen? Hatred. Absolute hatred. You're not born with hatred. I don't think you hate anybody. You won't hate anybody. But you're taught to hate. So when kids are quite small, and it's happening today too, they're taught to hate one group or another group. The Jews this and the Jews that, the blacks this and the blacks that, the Hispanics this and that, every Asian, one group talking down another group. Now you have it amongst yourselves, You'll get into a little fight at school with someone. You'll use bad names, call them names. That happens. We know about bullies. You have bullies in schools. But hatred is taught. You're not born with it. And where does it come from? Older people. Young people hear it. Little children hear it. Bad things about other people. And you grow up, and this hatred inside of you festers, it grows. You hate. To such a degree that a group of grown men ran planes into the World Trade Center. 9/11. These are grown men, hate, commit suicide, and killed 3,000 people because they were taught to hate. Little children today in parts of the world are being taught to hate. Little children today, this is an interesting thing, about 2/3 of the population of the world is, fairly okay financially. They have enough to eat. 1/3, that's 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. Every third person, every third kid, every third family lives on less than $2 a day. Now in the world, population of 6 billion, 6,000 million people live. 1/3 of them live on less than $2 a day. These kids grow up hungry. Their parents don't send them to school and they don't have the opportunities that you have. Math, science, literature, arts, athletics. They usher them off to what they call a school, and they sit. They don't know how to read and write. And they learned how to read their Bible, which is called the Quran, by heart. They learn it by heart. And then, after they study the Quran, their Bible, they're given lunch, which is probably the only decent meal that they get all day. And after that's done, they're taught how to hate. When they're not much older than you, they can strap armaments on their bodies and walk into McDonald's and blow themselves up. Hate. I hate you. This hate is manifested. It's given. It's passed down. I said there are 6 billion people in the world. Of the 6 billion, there are probably just about 2 billion Christians. 1/3 of all the people in the world are Christians. They're people who believe that Jesus Christ is the Messiah. Half of them are Catholic, the other half are Protestant. And there are other great religions. The second most populous religion is Muslim faith. About 1.5 billion people. And they don't necessarily live in the Arab countries as you think. They live in Near Eastern countries, Indonesia, places like that. Indonesia is totally Muslim. And that's people who adhere to the philosophy of Muhammad. And that's about 1.5 billion of them. That's a lot. And right now, there's a minority within that group that hates us. Not just Jews, because they want to kill all the Jews, annihilate all the Jews. But they hate Americans. Because we're Americans. They bomb embassies, hotels, ships, kill. That's how much hatred they were taught. And as I said, it's not the majority. Unfortunately, the majority has not spoken up and said it's wrong. We live in that kind of world today when people don't speak up to say something is wrong, which they should. The Jews are the moral conscience of the world. Believe in one God. Muslims believe in one God. Christians believe in one God. We all believe in the same God. There are other great faiths. About 500 years before the birth of Jesus, around 2,000 years ago, this is about 2,500 years ago, another great faith emerged, Hinduism. Hindus, about 1 billion Hindus, they live mostly in India. They follow certain dietary rules, they believe certain things, a little bit different, but they're also very family-oriented, have a good philosophy of life, believe in an afterlife, like heaven and hell, but they believe it a little differently. And another great faith at that time, just about the same time, Buddhism. There were about 500 million Buddhists in the world. Also a good philosophical faith. And before that, about 3,500 years ago, Judaism came into being. Abraham was the first Jew. That's about 3,500 years ago. So that's the first faith that said one God and totally as one God. So now you've got other people that believe in one God just as well, a higher being. I'm going to clue you in. Now, don't raise your hands. There are about 1 billion Jews in the world. If you did your math when I told you there were 6 billion, you discount, take your math of the other faiths that I told you about. There are about 500 million Jews in the world, 500 million. There are about 100 million Jews in the world. Don't raise your hands, but listen to this. And remember, 6.5 million almost were killed. There have never, ever been more than 13 million Jews in the world at any given time. That's it. Right now, today, 13 million Jews. I'm one of them. In the whole world. Less than 1/5 of 1% of the world population. And look at all the hullabaloo they make about us. We tell it like it is. That's why you're here. To gain some truths. Everything I've told you is factual. Now let's get back to this little boy, born in 1928. When I was 9 years old in 1938 in March, Hitler came into Austria. He didn't shoot. He didn't fight his way in. They opened up the borders. They welcomed the German troops, threw flowers out, welcomed them with open arms. Come on in. And they did. There was looting in the beginning in the city of Vienna. The city of Vienna is unique. It's very much like St. Louis. It's an old river town on the Danube. The Jews first came into that part of the world with the Romans in the year 300. The first Jewish house of worship was built on the Danube, on the banks of the Danube in the year 900. So they go back a long way. I was born in Vienna, Austria. My father was born in Vienna. My grandfather was born in Austria. We go way back. So there they were, they came in, and there's looting going on. Stores are broken into. Apartments are broken into. People are being beaten on the streets. This is when the Germans came in. Not by the Germans, by the Austrians, our neighbors. And this was in the very beginning. Naturally, my mother wouldn't let me go out. So I stayed home for a few days. I'm in 4th grade. And after things calmed down a little bit, and you would hear all kinds of things about molestations of women, beatings. It's time to go back to school. So I go back to school. School at that time was boys and girls, separate schools for boys and separate schools for girls. So here I am, 9 years old in 4th grade. And when school starts, as you stand up and you recite the Pledge of Allegiance, in Vienna, in the schools, they did not have a Pledge of Allegiance. They recited the Lord's Prayer in German, Unser Vater, wer ist im Himmel, Father who art in heaven. And all the kids stood up and recited the Lord's Prayer. Well, it had been about a week, and I hadn't been to school, and now I'm back in school. Things changed in 1 week. Not only did they recite the Lord's Prayer, and bear in mind, I'm Jewish. I stand up with the rest of them, but I don't recite the Lord's Prayer because it's not my prayer. I'm Jewish. And after they recite the Lord's Prayer, all these little boys, little 9-year-old boys and 10-year-old boys, raised their hand in salute to Hitler and pledged their allegiance to Hitler within 1 week. You got to be taught, don't you? And I was completely befuddled. I didn't know what this was all about. I would ask questions at home. I would hear certain things at home. People were leaving. They're leaving Austria. They're going to different places. It was called getting out. People tried to sell businesses if they could, to go someplace else, to another country. About a week later, the teacher said to me, I want to see your mother. But boy, that's always bad, when the teacher says, I want to see your mother. So my mother came to school with me. And the teacher said to my mother, it's better if Shorshi, that's me, my nickname, does not come back to school anymore because there's liable to be trouble and he might get hurt. You know, he's being nice. He says, don't let the kid come to school because he's going to get beaten up by the Nazi boys, by the Hitler youths. They're already organized. 9 years old. Hooray, no school. I go home. I have no brothers and sisters. I play with my toys. We didn't have television like we have today. Most of the information you got came on the radio, newspapers. But I remember things on the radio. I remember the voice of these Nazis. The Jews this and the Jews that. They're screaming and hollering, just as you've seen on some of the newsreels, just as you see some people today condemning other people in other groups, that they're bad, they're evil. I would also go to the movies on a Saturday, matinee. I remember that quite well. It's like getting a dime, you go to the movies. You've got TV now, so you don't have to go to the movies. But your parents all went to the movies to see things, cartoons, funny shows, and I would go. And I remember sitting there, and they had people like Stan Laurel and Oliver Hardy. They put the voices, German voices in instead of English, dubbed in the voices. Our favorite cowboy was Tom Mix. He's the original guy in the white hat, the original good Indian fighting cowboy. And I remember Tom Mix, and it was silent movies. I'm old enough to remember all that. And that's where you get information. But when the movie was over, and in between movies, there were newsreels. And there was always a guy in there in a uniform. They had slogans. Today Germany, tomorrow Europe. Later they had slogans. Today Europe, tomorrow the world. They're going to conquer the world. That's what they said. And whose fault was everything bad in the world? The Jews. The Jews. Let's blame it on the Jews. All 13 million of them throughout the world. A desperation set in with people. They had to get out. Now, getting out means leaving. Remember my history? My father was born there, my grandfather, my great-grandfather was Austrian. You got to get out. You got to have some place to go. Well, just think today you got some place to go. We just came back from China. We showed our passport. We gave them our passport, and we went all the way to China. Spent 16 days in China. Got to see the Great Wall, Tiananmen Square. Fascinating, fascinating country. Good people. For the most part, like what you have in the world. Well, you had to have a passport to go someplace. Now you're living in 1938 and you're in Austria and you want to go. Some people that I knew fled across borders, young people, teenagers, Italy, France, Switzerland. Parents gave them a few bucks, if you had a little bit of money, and they fled across borders because they knew there was no future for them. It's going to be bad for them. Now, people with families, they want to go. Where are you going to go? Well, I'd like to go to France. Oh, what are you going to do in France? Where's your passport? Oh, I don't have a passport. Well, you got to have a passport. You got to have a reason to go to France. And you must have a passport before you go there. You understand what's happening? You're trapped. Because you have to have a reason and a place to go. Somebody's got to want you. Now, if you happen to have a relative and you happen to have a little bit of money, it worked out. You were able to do, as some did. City of Vienna, 2 million people, very much like St. Louis, as I said, an old river town. The only difference was 10% of the population, about 200,000 in Vienna, were Jewish. It's an old city. Jews settled there for years, generations of my ancestors. 40% of all professional jobs, doctors, lawyers, teachers, any educators, were Jews. And 200,000 is a lot of people. In the Holocaust, fortunately, 2/3 got away with their lives. Out of the 200,000, 120,000 got out. 60,000 didn't make it. 1 out of 3. You live, you die. You live, you die. 1/3 of the people, I'm not picking on Euro particularly, but that's the statistics. That's what you had. And that's the way it was. Now people had to have a place to go. You needed a passport. You needed a place to go. Desperation set in. By the way, the maid that we had, she said she can't work for us because we're Jews. The chauffeur that my father had who drove us around couldn't drive us anymore, we were Jews. My uncle was a dentist. He couldn't fix the teeth of people who were not Jewish. Only Jews. He could only take care of the teeth of Jews. If you were a doctor, you could not have a non-Jewish patient, a Christian patient. If you're on the street, how can you tell a Jew from a Nun Jew? I walked on the streets and I looked and I remembered some things. I remember the policeman directing traffic on the corner. He still had his policeman's uniform on, but he now was wearing an armband with a swastika, which is to say, I not work for the Austrian government, I am a Nazi, I work for the German government. People had uniforms on, Nazi uniforms, obvious where they were coming from and who they were. The average person didn't. And if you're a Jew, you had to tread very lightly. The average person put on a little swastika in their lapels. That is to say, I am a Nazi. They were not part of the system. They were not employed by the Nazis necessarily. They were not officials. But I sympathize with the Nazi view. Our president today wears an American flag. Look at it. You'll see. He's always got an American flag on his sport coat or his coat, his suit coat. Many of the politicians wear American flags. That's to identify as an American. They identified as Nazis. There were those who were not necessarily Nazis. The Christians. But they didn't want to be put in the same mold as the Jews, so they put on little crosses, Some girls today wear crucifixes. That's to identify as Christian. Well, that's how people would identify Christian. What it said to anybody walking around was, don't mess with me, I'm not a Jew. What does a Jew put on? A swastika? A cross? Eventually, they had to put yellow stars on, as you saw in the museum. That was near the end. I was in the beginning. I was lucky. Now it's a question of getting out. It's the summer. It's tough. It's difficult. And I've been home for a while. No school. I said, Mom, can I go play with my friend across the street? And this is already like into May, June. And she said, okay, but be careful. Everybody's hoping for the best. So I get out and I cross the street. We lived on one of the main streets in Vienna. And as I'm crossing the street, there were 3 guys, maybe your age, already wearing their little Hitler Youth uniforms with their little swastika armbands coming towards me. And I knew, I'm not going to have anything to do with them. So as they go to the left, I go to the right. And as they go to the right, I go to the left. And they seem to come right towards me. And as I get to the curb, I had to face them. And there were 3 of them. And I'm 9 years old, and they look down at me, and one of them says, "Are you a Jew?" I peed in my pants. Yeah, I wet my pants. I denied my faith. I didn't want to be beaten up because I knew that's what they wanted to do. And one of them said, he's a Jew, all right. Guys your age, 10, 12 years old. Hate. I didn't know them. Another one said, I'll let him go. They probably spotted somebody else down the block. And I ran to my friend's house. And his father took me by the hand and led me back across the street. I was shaking. See, I learned something that day. I learned a couple of things. Learned I am a Jew. That's something I learned. I'm a Jew. I'm different. And also, it's not good being a Jew. That's what I learned. And in this wonderful country we live, we have Jews. There are more Muslims in this country than there are Jews. I don't know if you know that or not. We have all Jews are supposed to be rich, yeah. We have Jewish bakers, bartenders, bus drivers, baseball players. I'm only using the initial B. I can go down. Bookkeepers happen to be Jewish. Baseball players, yeah, Jason Marquis hasn't done too well for the Cardinals this year. He happens to be Jewish. And if you watched baseball game last night, Sean Green, who plays for the Mets, used to play for Los Angeles, happens to be Jewish. But the name isn't Jewish. They don't look Jewish. Yeah. Do I look Jewish? What does looking Jewish mean? You see where these people with hatred are coming from? The summer in Vienna is going on. Things are getting a little desperate. By the way, horse meat does not taste bad if it's made in the stew. We're running out of money. And towards the end of the summer, some of the people in the rest of the world, particularly in England, our good allies, are realizing what's going on. And they accept people to come to England to work. And the word goes out amongst Jewish women to apply for a job. My mother puts an ad in the newspaper in England offering her services as a cook, as a domestic. And she gets a letter back from a family, a place called Ivor Bucks, Ivor County in England. And the letter says, yes, if you can come here to England, we will give you a job as a cook for us. Guess what? She now had permission and a reason to go. She goes to the British embassy. The guy looks at it and says, yeah, here's a visa. You can go to England. Now she can get herself a passport. There were tens of thousands of people who thought they could get out. Some did. Managed to get passports. Stand in line here and stand in line there days. One of my uncles, before he went to work, used to get up and stand in line at 4 o'clock in the morning, and then he'd go to work at 8 o'clock, and my mother would relieve him so she could go to get her passport. She got her passport. I have them at home. I still have my parents' passports. Got her passport. She can go to England as a cook. Okay? Then something terrible happened later in November. If you recall inside, they called it about the breaking of the glass Kristallnacht, where they broke all the glass, broke all the stores, looted all the stores and what was left of them, broke into every house, Jewish house of worship. There were 90 odd houses of worship, including storefront synagogues in Vienna for the 200,000 people. They broke into all of them, burnt more than half of them to the ground. We had a large synagogue around the corner from where I lived. Sat 2,000 people in the sanctuary. This is in November, Kristallnacht. They burnt it to the ground. Not only did they burn it, they burnt the prayer books, the holy scrolls that the Jews used to pray from. I don't know if you've ever seen some of them outside, but they pray from these scrolls that they hold up. written by hand in Hebrew, and all the prayers are said in Hebrew. And they were burning them. I saw this. Do you know what's on those scrolls? The Bible. The people of hate were burning the Bible. And what's the Jewish worship service? Very simple. They read the Bible. They start in the beginning, the book of Genesis, in the beginning, go all the way through to the end, and then they have a holiday. And after the holiday, they start to read the Bible all over again. They happen to read it in Hebrew because that's their language. To this day. And those scrolls are written by hand to this day. That's what they were burning. By the way, first time I went back to Vienna was in 1970, 32 years after the rubble of the synagogue that they burnt was still standing. They hadn't cleaned up the rubble yet for 32 years. Does that tell you of something that's going on today in the world? And how people think, and how they hate, and how they want to forget? But we are not going to let them. Never again are we as Jews going to let something like that, like a Holocaust, happen again. 32 years later, the rubble was still there. I saw it. I went there. I had relatives in Vienna. Went to see my uncle, the dentist, who had returned to Vienna. He worked in a slave labor camp as a dentist during the entire war. Then came back and got his practice back as a dentist in Vienna. He was still alive. Cousins, an aunt. Went to see my aunt. Still have a cousin that lives in Vienna. Still have relatives there. How about that? He's a doctor, a physician, Pierre Genet, just retired. He is the son of my first cousin, who died about 3 or 4 years ago. We kept in touch. We keep in touch with Pierre. So nothing changes. 32 years later, they still hadn't cleaned up the rubble. By the way, I'm supposed to get some money from Vienna for our furnishings and the things that we owned. I'm 78 years old. I was 9 years old. I still haven't received 1 penny. They're waiting, We're supposed to get money. Oh, it's written. Haven't gotten it yet for the furniture. After Kristallnacht, after they did that, there's a knock on the door. 2 or 3 days later, 2 guys came over and asked for my father and my uncles who lived with us, my mother's brothers. One was home, one was not. And they said, Gestapo, you'll have to come with us. My father had been shaving. In those days, we didn't have electric razors. He had shaving cream on his face. And he took a towel and he wiped it off. And he was wearing a pajama top and street pants. And it was in November. And he said to my mother, Erna, I'll be right back. And she said, Paul, take your coat with you. See, it gets cold in November in Austria. So reluctantly, he put on his coat, and she stuck a cap in his pocket, little woolen cap. He's bald. I'm bald like my father. And he left. My uncle, my favorite Uncle Leo, and my father were taken away by these 2 Gestapo guys. They arrested 30,000 men that day. 30,000 were arrested by the Nazis, not the Germans. The only Germans I ever saw were soldiers who were on leave in the city of Vienna, having a good time. Austrians. Nazis not only in Austria, every country that they were in had their own Nazis. Every country, and turned in the Jews to the authorities. That's why 6.5 million of them had to die. Because Nazi doesn't mean Germany, just necessarily. It started there. It went all through there. It's a poison. The hatred was festered through there. Can you imagine my mother, the other mothers, the wives? Where's my husband? Where's my son? Where's my father? 30,000 of them were taken away. The rumors, who knows? About 10 days later, we get a postcard. I'm in Dachau. There were the first two concentration camps that they had were Dachau and Buchenwald. And they sent these 30,000. Not 30,000 because 10% of them never got there. Of the 30,000, 27,000 only made it to either Dachau or Buchenwald. My father was one of them. I'm in Dachau, I'm in so-and-so. The Germans always kept good records. They'll let you know where you were. And this is in the beginning. My father was one of the first Jews that was in Dachau. They had labor leaders there, Protestant ministers who were against the Nazis. They were there. It was not what it became later, a death camp, labor death camp. At least we knew he was alive. Here's my mother with a passport. She can go to England. What does she do with me? Her husband's in Dachau. Fortunately, the British, the English, again, they opened their hearts. And they accepted 10,000 Jewish children from Austria, Germany, Czechoslovakia, and took them into England, and something that was called a kinder transport. Occasionally you might see it on cable TV. It's called Into the Arms of Strangers. It's the story of 10,000 children who were saved by the English and taken to England, Jewish children. I was one of them. My mother got me on the kinder transport. I'm 10 years old. Just about your age. I remember I had a string with a cardboard and a number on it, and she put me on the train. And she said, now you go to England. Don't you get off anywhere. Don't you let anybody talk you out of it, because I'm going to be in England and I'm going to see you in England. We had friends that had preceded us that were working there. She gave me the addresses of these people. Now you've got to see so-and-so here, and you contact so-and-so there. They're already in England. I'm going to be, and you be sure you go to England, don't you? Long story short, I'm not going to talk about the trip. I don't have time. I got to England on the children's transport, one of the 10,000 little children that they saved. I came with the second group. The first group was an orphanage out of Berlin. They were already there. We were the second group in December of 1938. Now my mother's got to save my father. My father, fortunately, was an international soccer player. He played for the Austrian national team. And he had a lot of friends. And he's like the Pujols of his day. Well known, well liked, but he was a Jew. And she went from one bureau, Nazi bureau office building, to another one, until she found somebody who played soccer with my father in authority. And she said, you got Chundi, that was my father's nickname, you got him locked up in Dachau, my son is in England, I have a chance, here's my passport, I'm going to go to England, and blah, blah, blah. Well, anyway, the guy said, let me see what I can do. A week later, he told my mother, Chundi is going to come out of Dachau, but he's got to leave Austria within 45 days. Okay, now you know, leaving, going, which means you just get out. A little suitcase with your personal belongings, furniture, forget pets, cars, anything, property, anything that you own. You want to save your life, you want to get out. Because you see what this hatred has brought, what these people are capable of. My mother got my father out of Dachau. Now she's ready to go to England. I'm in England. The British once more opened their hearts. They took in several thousand grown men, provided they were under the age of 45. My father qualified. And took them to England. My father was one of them. he came up with what they call the men transport, a transport of men. Most people don't even know about this. So here I am in England, in foster homes and families and group homes, my mother working as a cook and my father in the camp. Fortunately, we had an uncle of mine, my father's youngest brother, lived here in the States. He got us a sponsor. A sponsor means somebody who vouches for you and says, you're not going to be a burden on society, and if you come to the United States, if anything goes wrong, we'll take care of it, which is fine. So we had permission now to come to the United States. I have the passports, all the dates, everything is verified. And all of this happened kind of late, because you got to understand, the Second World War, World War II, started in September of 1939. We are now in April of 1940. The war had been raging in Europe for almost 6 months. We arrived in Southampton. I don't have time to tell you about the trip and the circumstances of coming here. But my father and I crossed the Atlantic, more than 2 weeks to come across. It took a long time, reasons for this. I can't go into details. I don't have time to go into details. If you're interested, I can tell you a little later about the trip itself. And the three of us landed in New York with 3 little suitcases and $10. That's it. I'm 11 years old. They put me in 6th grade when I came here. Spoke very little English. My mother spoke very little English. My father spoke no English at all. Mother went to night school. Of course, I went to school. People say, you don't sound like a foreigner. Well, I guess I sound like an East Coaster, someone from New York, perhaps from an Italian neighborhood. Yes, I grew up in an Italian Catholic neighborhood in New York. I was president of my middle school, by the way. I will leave this with you. In this wonderful country that we live in, you who are now blossoming out, you're going to be in high school soon, and you're going to continue. You can be anything that you want to be in this wonderful country. The opportunities are there. If you're big enough and strong enough and you want to be a football player, you got a shot at it. I'm not saying you're going to be a football player or a baseball player, or tall enough for a basketball player, or attractive enough for a movie star, but you got a shot at it. You can be anything that you want to be, a brain surgeon, a mathematician. How many children in the world can say this? In this wonderful country, you have the opportunity. Listen to your teachers, listen to your parents. Trust them to do what's right for you. And as I said, the opportunities are there. You can be anything you want to be. And in closing, I just want to say, I thank you, and God bless America. And thank you again for listening to me.